Claire, welcome to Waterstones.
Thank you for having me. It's lovely to be here.
I would never usually recommend that a reader starts with the afterword of a book, but I am actually going to start there because I was amazed to discover after reading Shy Creatures that it has a basis in truth, a real case. Would you mind telling us a little bit about that inspiration?
Well, the true story behind the hidden man of the story is a newspaper article that I came across when I was trawling through sort of newspaper archives in search of inspiration about the 50s when I was writing Small Pleasures, and I just found it was a sort of treasure trove of interesting stories, and one of them that caught my eye was this story of this man called Harry Tucker, who'd been found in a house in Bristol living under the radar of the authorities and his neighbours for at least 2 decades, and it was sort of hairy and semi-feral, and living with his elderly aunt, the last surviving aunt of several. And he was sort of liberated from this strange house and taken to a psychiatric hospital where he seemed to be making good progress. And I thought, oh, this is an interesting little story. I wonder how, what happened to him? How did they treat him? And I couldn't find any more info from the newspapers. I sort of went forward in time a few months, hoping we'd find that he'd been miraculously rehabilitated and was now kind of living a useful life. But no, I couldn't find anything, and it made me realise the way, newspapers kind of pick up a story and then drop it very quickly when there's no new scandal or whatever. And then I found a whole year later a sad little piece saying that he'd unfortunately absconded from the hospital and either jumped or fallen into a river and drowned. And I sort of became preoccupied with this sort of sad story that he'd been so briefly liberated, and it seemed so promising, and then it ended so tragically. And I thought, I'd love to try and imagine him a past and a better future, and see if I could account for his state and then heal him in fiction, if not in life.
Okay, so that's really interesting. As you say, you wanted, I suppose, to give him the fitting ending that he didn't get in real life. You updated the story slightly in terms of time. So, as you said, that happening in the 50s, but you've moved it just forward a decade to the sort of mid-60s. Was there a particular reason for that? 2
reasons. I felt I didn't want to revisit the 50s of Small Pleasures too soon after having done that. I felt I didn't want to start re-going over all the same sort of details that I'd already worked to death. So I thought, no, I need a new decade. And also the 60s was a really interesting time in the history of psychiatry anyway. It's, R.D. Laing is just kind of coming to the sort of forefront, but hasn't had his sort of spectacular fall in terms of his experiment at Kingsley Hall, which kind of collapsed. So it's just an interesting time in the history of those large psychiatric institutions, which were becoming more progressive, more humane, less the stuff of our sort of nightmares really. And I just was interested in using the 60s as a time of change for my characters. As usual, they're not in the thick of the action. They're not living the lives of Patty Boyd and Marianne Faithfull. They're the sort of people who are on the margins, looking on at this brave new world with some trepidation and thinking, goodness, what's going on? What am I missing out on? And rather relieved to be missing out on it, one assumes. So that was what accounted for the move in decade.
Your hidden man is a man called William, and we'll sort of come to his story in a moment, but you do tell the story at first from the point of view of Helen, who is an art therapist within that sort of environment. Tell me a bit about her as a character and why she felt like the right person to be the viewer on this.
Well, it's always, once you've got the idea of the story, it's always who's going to tell the story, how am I going to approach it? And I didn't want it to be one of those psychiatrist-patient kind of dialogues, because I felt I'd read many of those and I didn't feel I'd got much to add to that. And art therapy was a relatively new sort of discipline's not quite the word for it, treatment. And I thought having somebody who's lower down the hierarchy than a psychiatrist or a doctor, but is a sort of therapist, would be more fruitful. And so I hit on a relationship that's not a romantic relationship. It's a sort of professional relationship between Helen, the art therapist, and William, who turns out to have some artistic gift, and that's what will connect them. And then it also, because she's a woman and she's in a sort of problematic relationship with one of the psychiatrists at the hospital, that gives me the opportunity to explore other forms of social imprisonment, you know, the family, marriage, whatever, and alongside William's version of imprisonment, boarding school, the institution, the family, whatever. So I had more ways of exploring those themes.
And the story of William is told in reverse. So we have these chapters from his point of view, which take us back in regular sort of intervals, so that we can discover really, as you say, why he has ended up hidden away in this house. Were you always, I suppose, clear that you were going to tell that story in reverse in order to have that sort of reveal, or did that come through the process of writing?
No, I think I always wanted to tell his story backwards. I wanted to have Helen's story, his present, and Helen's story going forwards, and his past going backwards, and then sort of meeting in a way. And I just wanted to do something different from my previous book, and I hadn't ever used this structure before. And it certainly does throw up some challenges when you're trying to reveal things which would be obviously chronologically later, but the later stuff is right at the beginning of the book. So trying to withhold information backwards is quite a challenge, and I found that, you know, that sort of tested me almost to destruction. But it's an interesting way of doing it. I can see why people don't do it more often, because it's once you've told something, you can't add to it, because you're never revisiting that era again. You're always going back on yourself. So it is a challenge, and it's not quite as straightforward as you can't just tell the story forwards and rearrange the chapters. It's not like that. It just doesn't work that way round. So it's a test for the writer's patience.
Well, you succeeded. The hard work was worthwhile. There are some really, really interesting themes in this book, and you've mentioned one already, which is this, I suppose, this idea of imprisonment, which can be literal in some cases and a little bit more sort of philosophical in others. With William, as you mentioned, he goes to a boarding school, which of course is a form of imprisonment, and then has this strange upbringing with his aunts within this house. Tell me a little bit about writing his character, because there's this really fascinating thing that, starved of human contact, he starts to have much closer connections with animals, for example, and things like that. Tell me about writing that form of imprisonment.
Well, the main thing I found with writing it was going backwards. He became progressively more normal as we go back through time. It's his, the length of time that he's incarcerated that makes him stranger and stranger. So he's as strange as he ever gets when we meet him, and gradually, as you go back, he becomes the boy he once was before it all went wrong. So that was a kind of an interesting sort of backwards character development. And yes, his relationship with nature and creatures and fictional characters, he has a sort of powerful relationship with books that he reads and things like that, which I suppose you would if you're incarcerated and you don't meet many other young people growing up. And of course, in his memory, that the relationship with his one school friend and that family, which is a sort of consuming passion or obsession of his, the one time he was happy and safe becomes a sort of mythological memory of his. So that was all fun to write, because it's kind of odd and strange and interesting.
There are other very subtle relationships in the book which have other forms of imprisonment. So Helen's brother has a daughter, her niece Lorraine, who I suppose is one of the first teenagers. If we think about that period of the sort of 60s, is when that phrase really started to become a thing. And she is slightly, I guess, a prisoner within her parents' household, who they have slightly different values. Tell me about creating her as a character, because she's really, really interesting.
Well, I think my research into R.D. Laing was what threw up this character, because there's a really interesting book that he wrote with Aaron Esterson called Sanity, Madness and the Family, and it's a series of case studies of teenage, mostly girls, being interviewed about their schizophrenia as it was diagnosed, and then interviews with their immediate families, and they're really just transcripts of the interviews. And it does become apparent reading these that these girls are really just kind of confounded by their social circumstances, and that they've been utterly bewildered and confused by the conflicting messages they get from their parents, And I tried to sort of bring that to Lorraine, her mother saying, you don't like going out, Lorraine. Lorraine says, I do like going out. No, you don't. You don't like going out. You're a homebody. And then, she never leaves her room. She's and so she can never win, because whatever she does,
Yeah.
her mother's telling her that's not what she should be doing. So she's in a state of sort of bewilderment, and I felt that was probably quite typical for a lot of young people in this period, 16-year-olds in the early 60s, who were getting these very conflicting messages from society about, youth and rebellion and change, and but living in deeply conservative families,
Yeah.
where that was highly resisted, and I just thought she would be an interesting foil for William as another kind of person who is in a much milder way a prisoner of circumstances.
That phrase homebody, it comes up a couple of times actually, and it's really interesting because, as you say, it's sort of people being told that they like to be at home and then they don't like to go out, and that's not necessarily the case. And I suppose part of that is to do, in Lorraine's case, with her parents wanting to protect her from the world. And that idea of where love tips over into something which is a little bit closer to control is one of the other themes of the book. Tell me a bit more about why that was an important thing to write about, and I suppose the subtleties of it in different relationships.
Yeah, I mean, I felt like none of the characters are acting malevolently. They're controlling, and their obsessions are sort of well meant. It's all about protection of the young person or whatever, and these themes come up again and again. And indeed, each time the young person tries to, rebel against it, or each time William, on the rare occasions William goes outdoors, something terrible happens, and it confirms his fears and his family's fears that it's not safe, and that he's better off inside or whatever. And I don't know whether all these ideas were kind of boiling around in my head because we'd just come through lockdown. I don't know if it was a kind of an interest in confinement that had come about from being confined, but I just certainly found it just very interesting, the way people are well intentioned and entirely not malevolent, but nevertheless are causing incredible harm by their interest in protecting someone from these sort of phantom dangers.
That idea of the world being a dangerous place is very, very clear, as you say, particularly because of the things that happened to William in his childhood. And I suppose one of the people who is going against that would be the psychiatrist Gill in the story, who believes in this sort of slightly more open hospital where patients are really allowed to roam and to be free. But at the same time, he has quite a sort of controlling hand, I suppose, over his relationship with Helen. Tell me about that sort of dichotomy.
Well, he's an interesting character, I think, and much more. I think the older you are, the more sympathetic you are to him. I find that younger female readers think he's a monster, whereas people of my generation knew people like that, and they were, although you wouldn't want them married to your daughter, they were not entirely malevolent. They're just flawed people.
Yep.
And I just wanted to have somebody who was, he's very charismatic and he's principled about his patients. He doesn't like the idea of medicating his patients, and yet his wife is self-medicating with alcohol because of her rotten marriage, and his lover is self-medicating with sleeping pills and the contraceptive pill, to facilitate their relationship. And so the ironies of his kind of very liberal regime towards his patients, but at the same time the unnecessary suffering of his loved ones is apparent. But nevertheless, I wanted to make it clear that he was very attractive, and that Helen's attraction to him was not unbelievable, and that there people aren't complicated, and you can be a 90% nice, good, decent person, and then 10% terrible, and that's probably the mix we've got with him. And he becomes more terrible as the book progresses, and less his behaviour becomes more questionable and less acceptable. But at the same time, there is a sort of it's not all black and white. There's sort of shades of grey with him.
There are lots of really amazing sort of, not set pieces, but scenes in the book, and one that I particularly enjoyed was when William was attempting to cook for himself for the first time. trying to make a cottage pie and assuming that the way that you make mashed potato is that you just simply boil potatoes until they turn into mash. So he ends up with this kind of very watery slop that goes over the top. I just love that scene because it tells you everything you need to know about how cosseted he's been, that he just doesn't have an understanding about how to do that. Did you have any favourite sort of scenes or moments when writing the book?
Yeah, there's always bits that you when you come across it when you're rereading, you think, oh, I like this bit, and there are many more. You think, oh, this is dragging, and you think, why didn't I get rid of this when I was writing it if it's dragging now, you know? But there's always bits that you think, oh, I like this little bit, and my favourite bit, without being too much a spoiler, is a letter from Aunt Rose that sort of tells something of the story much later on in the book, and I like that bit. I liked her sort of rather plaintive voice, but yeah, there were other moments of conflict are always fun to write. So, you know, there's a scene between Helen and her parents, which is a sort of pivotal moment where she finds out something about Gil, and then has to mask it from her parents, and so that's fun to write. Conflict and, you know, difficult moments are always better to write about than good times, you know.
Well, as you say, for that moment, which we won't spoil, but as I say, because it's an absolute sort of gut punch of information that she receives that she cannot reveal. And so I suppose for you as the novelist writing the interiority of a character, just a perfect moment to sort of describe. The book is filled with moments like that, Claire, and I really, really enjoyed reading it, and even more fascinating to discover not only that it was sort of based on truth, but to hear a bit more about your process for writing it. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. It's been a pleasure.